Welcome to yet another Basar B'chalav class. We are continuing in Yoreh Deah, chapter 87, Siman Pei Zion, and we are still in Sif Aleph. However, we are still discussing the three parts of the prohibition of Basar B'chalav. So we said that it's mentioned three times in the Torah. It's Echad L'Isser Bishul. One is for the cooking prohibition. We spent a couple of weeks talking about that prohibition. Echad Isra Achila. Another part of it is to prohibit the eating of Basar B'chalav. Echad Isra Hana. Right, so we talked about that in our first shir. Tonight we're going to talk about what is the Isra Achila, because we've been talking about the Isra Bishul. So now let's talk about the Isra Achila. Zok the Gemara in Chulin. Okay, this is Kuf Tes Vav Amabes 115b. So Rabbi Yishmael, the school of Rabbi Yishmael, taught the following: Lo Tavash Gadiba Chalevi Moshe Shapamim. Right, we said it says it three times. Echad Isra Bishul, Echad Isra Achila, Echad Isra Hana. Okay, and that is the Tana there. So the Gemara Zok Weiter. It says Isi ben Yehuna had the following statement. It says Minayin lebasar b'chalav she'aser. How do we know that basar b'chalav is prohibited? Okay, we say here, Ki am kadosh ata. It says by this verse, you are a holy nation. And then after that it says, V'anshe kodesh tiyun li. You shall be a holy nation unto me. Okay, V'sar b'sadei treifa lo tochelu. And eat not the torn flesh, or the torn animal's flesh. Malhal and aser, just like treifa, that flesh is torn, is prohibited. Afkan aser. So this is what we meant that we said that it's prohibited for eating. Ainli elu b'achila, and this is only to tell me about it's eating it, like putting it in your mouth, chewing it, and swallowing it. B'hanoam minayin. Now, what if you take benefit from it? Meaning, benefit defined by Chazal means that you could take this item and turn it into food. That's considered benefit. You could take it, sell it, and the proceeds from that can make it into food from some other way. So how does that extend to it? So I'm going to say it's a kal v'chomer. It's from making in a logical progression in this statement. What's the progression? Uma arla shlo navda ba'avera, just like arla, which simply grew on the tree, and it has only been there in the first 3 years. That's prohibited without doing anything wrong to it. That's prohibited by Hana. Basar b'chalav, you went ahead and you cooked it, right? You did the first prohibition. Now we're extending it to another prohibition. Okay, that's the Gemara over there. So we see Isra Hana comes from two different places in the Gemara over here. You have another source over here. This is on Kuf Yadal Amavez. This is on Chulin 114. Amar Rav Ashi. So Rav Ashi says, from where do we find that Basar b'chalav is Asar b'achila? So he's asking the same question. Lo tochlu kol toeva. Do not eat any disgusting or despicable thing. Kol she'ta'avti lecha harihu beval tochal. All that I have made disgusting to you will be concluded in the prohibition of don't eat it. V'ein li ela b'achila, but that only seems to extend to consuming it. B'hanam minayin. So where do we find that benefiting from it is extended to it as well? Rabbi Abahu. Rabbi Abahu explains how this works. Amar Rabbi Abahu, Amar Rabbi Elazar, Kol makom shneimar lo yachel lo tochel lo tochelu. Every time we see in the Torah it says, let you not consume it, let you not eat it, that all of you not eat it. Echad Isra Achila, Echad Isra Hana b'mashma. Not only is it prohibiting consuming it, it's also prescribing benefiting from it. Until it actually explains to you that there is a special rule that you can benefit from it, like it says by an animal that has died. And the Gemara goes on about that. The Gemara goes on and says, because by the nevela, you can give it to the dog, and you can sell it to a Jew, a non-Jew who is a ger toshav. He is a resident alien, but hasn't accepted the mitzvahs on himself, right? So those are some of the things over there. Now, Rashi says something really interesting over here. It says, "Kol sheti avdi l'cha," everything that I have made disgusting to you. So everything that I have prohibited to you as something that is disgusting and to have it kept away from you, that is something that is included in this prohibition of eating. Okay, and that prohibition is a permanent one in every situation, whether it came through some prohibited action or whether it just was prohibited through force of law. For example, if something became prohibited by a child doing it or some non-Jew acting upon it. So since I have made it despicable to you, it remains prohibited. And this thing, since I have made it disgusting to you, it extends itself to the cooking, which is to prohibit cooking them together. And then the Gemara continues on and says, until the Torah itself extends to you a permission, like it does by Nevela, and Rashi explains, which is that even though it says that you should not eat an avela, right? You shouldn't eat an animal that died. I'm trying to explain to you that there is a permission for benefit in that case. So in every other place where I don't tell you how it's permitted, I should assume that when I say don't eat it, I also mean don't benefit from it. So the Gemara continues on later on in Kuf Yud Ches in 118. So the Gemara says, if I have half, and we saw this Gemara previously, if I have half a zayas of meat and I have half a zayas of milk, and I cook them together, so we say that they attach to each other, and you're a chayev for that. You're chayev, the prohibition is attached to a law that requires you to get lashes. It would be the appropriate punishment for eating basar v'chalav. So the Rambam says in Hilchos Ma'achal Asuros, this is the beginning of chapter 9, where he discusses the prohibition, and he says, and so too, if you eat a kazayas of basar and chalav that have been cooked together, one receives lashes, okay? Even if you did not do the cooking yourself. So the idea is you receive lashes for the cooking, and now we're talking about the eating. The Torah says here on our siman, he says that the Isser Basar B'chalav says that one should not cook a kid in its mother's milk. And it's recited 3 times. So the Torah is quoting the Tana of Rabbi Yishmael he brought originally. And so he says those are the 3 prohibitions from that case, which is one is for cooking, one is for eating, and one is for benefiting. And it says achila in language of Bishul, lo tevashel, right? Saying when I say don't cook it, I also mean don't eat it, which is to say that the Torah only prohibits it when the prohibition is done through the cooking action, but rabbinically we prohibit every type of mixture where the 2 things mix. Okay, so that is how we get to our halacha. Now let us dive into eating. So eating requires that you have to eat a kazayas. We've established that. So now let's look at that. What is a kazayas? Okay, so the interesting thing is there is a wonderful section of Shulchan Aruch. It's in Orach Chaim, and it's Siman Tuf Pei Zayin, Tuf Pei Vav. It's 486 in the Shulchan Aruch, and there it's exactly this one line. The size of kazayas, right? This is one of the most important things established in all of halakha. Some say it's like the half the size of an egg. Okay? Now, to be fair, Shulchan Aruch was coming at the end of the larger discussion. So we're not going to go through a really long limud on what this looks like. The Beis Yosef himself, there, if you want to go learn through it, goes through a lot of it. The Mishnah Berurah basically says that this half of an egg that the Shulchan Aruch is talking about is a medium-sized egg with the shell on it. Okay? And the Rambam says that it's a third of the egg. And there are other opinions, such as the Magen Avraham and the Gra, and it's a very long sugya, which we're not going to give a class on Hilchos Kazayas. We're going to give a class on Basar B'chalav. So just know that that is basically how much you have to eat in order to violate the prohibition of achila. Okay, so for our purposes, this should suffice informationally. But it is an interesting way to look at how they arrive at those different sizes. I ain't John. Okay. Now, normally we hold that eating less than this is also prohibition. That's a Gemara in Yuma talking about eating in general. On Yuma, page 74a, Ayin Daled and Aleph. And so it's a machlekes. Okay, so the Gemara asks the question, half of the amount, chatzi shir. Rabbi Yochanan says it's Torah prohibition. Rish Lakish says it's not. Okay. Rabbi Yochanan says it's Torah prohibition. Why? Because it's part of the larger shir. Meaning, I have to eat some of the zayas in order to get to the whole zayas. So therefore, it's prohibited. I'm just not liable until I eat a certain amount. Okay. So as a force of law, meaning it's not that it's permitted to eat less. It's just that you aren't held liable until you eat a significant enough amount that you actually have had something that you've considered eaten. Okay? And Rish Lakish says, no, right? It says you have to eat it, and this is not considered eating, right? This is like I licked it, right? So we paskin like Rabbi Yochanan, and we say that it's a Torah prohibition, okay? But the prohibition does not attach to lashes until you eat the full kazayas. Okay, so now we established that those are the simple ways to look about it. What if you ate basar b'chalav, but you ate it in a way where you're not really benefiting from it? So what does that mean? So this is another interesting Gemara, which talks about doing exactly that. This Gemara is in Pesachim, and it's on page 25a. So the Gemara is talking about kilai hakerem. So this is where I take wheat and I grow it inside of a grape vineyard, and it prohibits the grapes. Okay? Now, the Gemara is pointing out over there that I seem to be violating that prohibition, even though I have benefited from it. Like I put the wheat and the vineyard together, I grow them together, they grow, and at that point, I can be taken to the court, testified against, and be given lashes. Now, Abaye says, what is this case? So this is a case similar to basar b'chalav. Now, if it's similar to basar b'chalav is only violated when one actually benefits from it. Okay? So the Gemara then fires back, does basar b'chalav actually say you need to eat it? Right, it doesn't. He's always established it doesn't, so it's a rhetorical question. So the person who asked the question, the Gemara says, that's why you have to say it comes from a case of a similar law by nevela, by an animal that has died, which you're not allowed to eat because it's not proper shechita. So, but by nevela, we established in that same Gemara that you have to actually benefit. It has to be a beneficial consumption. So basar b'chalav should also be that way. So Abaye then says, that's why it doesn't say achila exactly in it, okay? Which is to tell me that even when you don't get hana out of it, you don't get a personal benefit from it, it could technically still be isser, if you cook it, right? So Rashi points out that, so basar b'chalav don't say the word achila in it, but you are therefore held accountable even when you haven't actually gotten physical benefit from it. So this is the statement here in this Gemara is there's a machlokes amongst the Amoraim in the Talmud as to whether or not basar b'chalav, if it is used for a non-eating purpose, causes you to be liable to lashes. According to Abaye, yes, because since the word achila is not stated in there, I could benefit from some other way and still be liable for it. And the person having the argument with him, who's not stated in the Gemara, is basically saying that you have to have normal consumption. So the Rambam in the 14th chapter of Machalos Asuros, he says the following rule: says that all things that are prohibited by eating, you're only liable to their punishment when you eat them in the normal manner in which they're meant to be consumed, except for basar b'chalav and kilai hakerem. Why? Because achila is not written in their prohibition. It said something else, right? So that doesn't count. So therefore, the language of cooking and the language of being set aside, which is written in those two things, is to prohibit them even if they are not benefited from in the normal fashion. Okay, and this is quoted as the norm of halacha by the Sefer Kresi Uplesi in the two different works mixed together in the Plesi side in number 15. The Rambam further says that there's an example of this. So how does this work? So you melt down the butter, or in this case, you boil down the milk, okay, and you swallow it when it's hot until your throat burns, okay, and then or let's say you take fresh milk, okay, or you mix something bitter inside of the milk, okay, something like wormwood, okay, which is very bitter, right? And you pour those things into another prohibited substance, like you put that into yain nesach. Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. He said the word over here actually is chalev. I'm sorry. Now I'm looking at it again. All right. You take chalev. You swallow chalev. Chalev is a forbidden fat. So you swallow chalev like when it's hot, so it burns you, right? So you swallow hot chalev, so it's burning you, so it's not a normal form of it. Okay. Or you ate raw fat. Okay. So you cut it right out of the animal and swallowed it. Or you mix the bitter things into yain nesach, wine that was used in a service that poured wine as a libation to avodah zarah. Okay, or you pour something bitter into a pot that's cooking non-kosher meat, and you eat them when they are bitter. Or if you eat something that's prohibited after it has putrefied, right? So you lift it out of the fridge and it got nasty, and for some reason you ate it. Well, so it's not really something that a person would eat. And all these situations, you are not liable to lashes, even if people testify of seeing you eat it. He ate that cheeseburger that was left behind. Not a cheeseburger. He ate that McDonald's burger that was left behind the couch. Okay. Now, if you do something like that, if you take something bitter and mix it into basar b'chalav or kilai karim, you're now liable. Okay. So the Pri Megadim points out that the statement of the Rambam is limited to where the basar b'chalav was already prohibited and you add something bitter to it afterwards. And in that situation, you are still liable to its consumption, even though they're not able to be eaten. However, if before cooking them, they become completely ruined from being food, either the meat or the milk, that is not a Torah prohibition. Why? Because it has to be a normal form of cooking that would be prohibited. Okay? And that's what the Torah is prohibiting. And as long as it hasn't gotten a good flavor, the prohibition doesn't apply. And so therefore, if you took wormwood and threw it into the milk and then cooked the meat in it, that would not violate the prohibition of basar b'chalav. It's only if they were already prohibited together. You take milk that's fresh, you take meat that's fresh, you cook them together, and then you take it and you smush it in something disgusting, right? You pour bleach all over it, and then you eat it. So now you're chayav, right? So if you take that, if you take that basar b'chalav, right, you rub it in bleach and eat it, that's going to be prohibited. Okay, so the question is there's the question we're going to address here in just a second that we have to consider, that other achron we're going to consider, is what is the difference between basar b'chalav when it's a flavor that is not tasty versus when it is. Okay? So, and what does it matter if the flavor comes in afterwards? Because if there's not shishim, then the flavor should be transferring. The prohibition should still apply. So what we have to say is that the flavors have to be normal flavors, and that is something that is attached to normal consumption, like nevela and like chalev, that still attaches to a normal mixture of basar b'chalav, meaning the basar is judged independent and the chalav is judged independent. And this actual consideration affects another din that we'll talk about later, known as tam ki'ikar. And the idea is whether or not the flavor that comes from the item, the meat flavor from the piece of meat, the milk flavor from the milk, are those considered by the Torah to be the same as having the actual item there? So we see in a number of those cases that the flavor itself, when it is ruined, does not prohibit the other thing. So this is a special rule, exception by Basar B'chalav. Okay, and only when the flavors themselves are flavorful and tasty, they have to be something that adds to your enjoyment. But if it does not at that time, then it does not attach itself to the prohibition of Basar B'chalav. Something interesting there. Okay, so that's what a lot of poskim quote this Pri Megadim for the halacha. There is an exception over here in the book Chavos Das from Yaakov Elisa, and he makes this statement later on in Hilchos Taruvos. So this is in Siman Kuf Gimel. He makes a statement over there that the prohibition the Gemara is referring to is when it becomes a little bit ruined. Okay, and in that situation, the flavor is not normal. If something doesn't taste a little off, that's one thing. But a Basar B'chalav, when it's not edible at all, and it itself has become really disgusting, and not because you've mixed in, wormwood or something else like that, so the bitterness does it. So then, if it's through its own self, then the prohibition of Basar B'chalav itself is released from the objects, and there's no prohibition that attaches to it because they're not flavorful. The prohibition only attaches to something that is flavorful. That's his svar. So a little bit different over there. The Stei Chemed brings this down as well, and he quotes a few other poskim like that. But nonetheless, most people seem to take the approach of the Rambam as explained by the Pri Megadim that we just quoted. Okay, and also in the place that mentioned as well. So those are some interesting things about what's considered benefiting from it. So one last interesting thing over here is that the Chavos Das and Stei Chemed, they actually take the approach that when the Rambam says you have to add something to it, that when you eat something prohibited after it is itself gone bad, okay, and it's no longer considered an edible thing, so Basar B'chalav is something where you mix it at the time of the prohibition. And so therefore, there seems to be something different with the two things. So that's how Achila works out. So Achila in and of itself, as we see here, has to be in a situation whereby one is actually benefiting from the consumption and one is going to eat it in a way which would be normal. So just to kind of summarize what we have learned here about Achila, we're seeing that Achila generally has to apply to foods that are edible. They have to be cooked together. And at the time of the prohibition, they should be something that is readily able to be consumed. And so the general assumption would be that if the foods are fresh and you cook them together, they are prohibited. Should you try to take Basar B'chalav and try to ruin it afterwards, it doesn't work. So this would have a number of interesting applications. If Basar B'chalav was mixed into, let's say, something, right, for medicinal purposes, and you take it and it turns into a powder, and it's a big white pill, and it has no flavor. So if Basar B'chalav is in that, you're going to have a problem with consuming it. So you would have to say that pill wouldn't be permitted to be consumed, even shlo k'derech achila, because we're establishing that Basar B'chalav is unique in that you can't benefit from it, even when the consumption is done in an abnormal fashion. So that's something unique and interesting about Basar B'chalav, as opposed to, let's say, eating the vela in situations where you break it down and it becomes inedible, it would lose its prohibited status. That's why many poskim would permit certain things like gelatin and things where the prohibited items themselves were broken down and not edible at all in their form, and they were broken down for their compositional parts. So, for example, gelatin or collagen is a component of the original prohibited item, bone, skin, so on, of an animal. And even if the animal is or is not kosher, those items are themselves not really edible, and therefore breaking it down could see some leniency in those situations. Other people argue and say that it's still prohibited rabbinically, but then that means we would all agree that by the Torah standards, it would not be an Isser Achila. So we'll wrap up with that tonight. We'll pick up next time, talk about Isser Hana, and also learn a little bit about the halacha l'maisa, about the basar b'chalav. So we'll get that into next week's year. Thank you for watching, and please remember to like and subscribe and get all notifications.